Hello everyone, this is Bob Brown with Community Coronavirus Update number 56. Today we'll talk about learning from our mistakes and hopefully some light at the end of the tunnel. So basically, if you look at Johns Hopkins numbers from this morning, we're almost 320,000 deaths in the United States. And one of the things that frustrates me about this is I would also say that those deaths were as much due to partisanship as they were due to coronavirus. If we look at other countries, and how they've dealt with the pandemic, we see a huge variation in performance. And as I like to tell people in my day job, that the ultimate quality measure for healthcare and public health is dead, not dead. And so basically, I think at a population level, the higher up the percentage of your population that died tells you how bad you did as far as your country's performance. In the US, UK, France, Spain, all kind of doing equally as bad, I would say. Luckily, none of us as bad as Belgium, of course, but really we should start looking to who did it right. Countries like Japan, Norway, Ireland, Germany. Now, some people would say, well, Japan's a unique situation. If anything, though, I would say they were perfectly set up to have a bad pandemic because they're so urban, densely populated, an older population. But they did a very good job with their contact tracing and getting a hold of things really quickly. If we had responded like Japan, we'd have had only 7,000 deaths instead of 320,000. Some would say, well, Japan's in a unique situation because they're an island country, to which I would respond, well, so are Ireland and so is the United Kingdom. And so performance vary, and so geography isn't necessarily destiny. The other countries I would point out would be Sweden and Norway, which are culturally somewhat similar neighboring countries. One took a going for herd mentality, the other did not, and the deaths are 10 times as high in Sweden as Norway, and rapidly climbing. It's likely that Sweden may end up catching these countries here in the next few weeks because their pandemic has gotten out of control. Their numbers are actually just as bad as the United States and potentially worsening. Their ICUs are full. They closed down their high schools and went remote. And so they're in a partial lockdown state. So this going for herd approach to Sweden that some thought was a great idea has turned out to be wrong, unfortunately. So one thing I like this, I forwarded this on Facebook a while back because it really spoke to me about accountability and what really it means. And you can have two different approaches. You can blame people, make partisan excuses, or you can acknowledge reality, own it, and find solutions. And start looking at the numbers, looking at the performance, be honest about it, and quit trying to dodge what was potentially a bad idea. Now, we all entered this pandemic with a lot of theories, but at the end of the day, numbers speak for themselves, and we need to start adjusting accordingly. So you can also look at that in Johns Hopkins State and then site and go to Admin 1 and start looking at state by state comparisons as well, which I've used a couple of these. Here last week I put on a Facebook post comparisons some hypotheticals if Nebraska had acted like either Maine or if it had acted like Lincoln Lancaster County. And so essentially, the results varied across our states just like it varied across other countries. New York got hit right away, as did Illinois. California is now catching up, unfortunately. But I would look at South Dakota, North Dakota, Nebraska, and Maine because they're all fairly rural states, had time to prepare. The Dakotas basically decided as a state pretty much to go for herd. Nebraska, it was kind of split based on where you lived. But I would say Maine did it right. And if we had acted like Maine, we'd have 1,000 fewer deaths in Nebraska. And if the rest of the state had acted like Lincoln and Lancaster County, we'd had 683 fewer deaths. What did Maine do right? Well, one, their effort was led by a public health expert, Narev Shah. I put a link to the Scientific American article that talked about kind of how they did it. One of the most important things they did, in addition to having a well-designed response, was to just have straight talk about what the COVID virus meant, what the numbers showed. He did twice a week podcasts, Q&As, talking to everybody, trying to explain how this works, why it works, and so they were very honest about the numbers, I think, and then they had a great communication strategy. They also did a very good job with contact tracing. So many of you heard about the Maine wedding, where they tracked out one exposure, infected 155 other people, 176 eventually were tracked back to this wedding. 7 people died. None of them were at the wedding. It was basically due to other places like correctional facilities and long-term care center. And so they tracked it back and publicized it. People could understand how something as simple as a wedding could lead to hundreds of infections and 7 deaths in this case. An example I would say of bad communication, fortunately, is the Test Nebraska email that I got this week. So part of the problems with Test Nebraska previously has been their slow turnaround. Thankfully, this is fixed. I actually got my test result in 12 hours, which is great. And so they're doing a little bit better as far as their logistics. Unfortunately, I'm really critical about their communication strategy. The most important thing to do from a communication standpoint right now is emphasizing the importance of a mask, and especially when they're around others who are outside of your household. But if you look at the Test Nebraska email, and this is the email I got from them, you have to go way down to the second page to actually see what's probably one of the most important messages to be put out there. In newspaper speak, that would be called burying the lead, and then so you should be putting the most important information at the top, not at the bottom. The other thing is the information about COVID-19, which is a little skewed in how it's written, and in one point I would actually say factually incorrect. So, for example, they talk about the fact that current estimate risks of death in the U.S. will be less than 1%. That is true, but it kind of glosses over the fact that if we just let it run through our state, that would be 5 to 10,000 dead Nebraskans, something we should avoid, and this seems to minimize that. The other thing they say is 50 to 70% of the population will eventually get this infection. That is actually not true. First of all, if we let it run, that could happen, although herd immunity is probably well above 50%, which is what I think they're trying to claim here. Most people think herd immunity is probably in the 60 to 70% range, potentially higher if some mutant strains start evolving over time. But the goal should not have been, it's telling people that 50 to 70% of you will get this, that it should be this, what could happen if we don't do the right thing, like wear masks. We could have kept infections down in the 10 to 20% range at most, had we taken a better effort, prevented 1,000 deaths, and waited for a vaccine, which is now on its way. And so I think this is a very misleading way to communicate things, and I wish they'd redo this email that they send out to Test Nebraska to every Nebraskan who gets a test through them. So one of the things you may have heard about lately is this potential new variant in the United Kingdom and also in South Africa. The bad news is that it's looking like this variant spreads more rapidly, and so what that would mean is that the herd immunity may be a higher number in that 70-80% range. And so what they show is basically that this one variant has rapidly become the dominant variant in the United Kingdom. Now, so far it looks like this does not mean that the infection that you would get from it is more severe, but potentially it would be infecting more people, which could then lead to more deaths just because more people would get infected, and it would be harder to get herd immunity. So far, evidence says that the vaccine, it doesn't look like the vaccine would be harmed by this mutation, but it could. The good news is the mRNA vaccines can be changed rapidly in case this does happen. So I'm not so concerned about this as long as we don't let our virus run amok. Because the more the virus runs amok, the more opportunities it has to mutate and create other variants, unfortunately. And so again, back to the state, Nebraska, we had very different ways we approach the pandemic. Lincoln Lancaster County is unique, and the reason why is because our health department was formed before the current state laws that regulate health departments, so we were grandfathered in. And Lincoln Lancaster County was able to create its own public health directives, which were more, I thought, finely tuned and better crafted, and so I think that is part of the major reason why we've kept our death rate lower in the 42 per 100,000 as opposed to Douglas County and the rest of the state. Although Omaha as a city did put a mask ordinance, it only covered parts of Douglas County because Douglas County includes multiple suburbs like Millard, Ralston, places like that, and so it wasn't as effective as it could have been. And so I think this is part of the problem, is that we didn't have a consistent status response based on best evidence, and it results in more deaths, unfortunately. And there are many ways you can look at that. The numbers aren't going to line up exactly between slides because they're pulled. The date range from Global Pandemics is from a couple days ago. But again, it says how surrounding areas did compared to each other. And at the end of the day, dead, not dead, decides who did the best. So my hope for this, our next stage, is that we'll try to make an effort to keep Nebraska deaths below 2,000. We're about 1,500 now. If we could successfully vaccinate everybody and slow down our pandemic, I think we could do this. But if we continue with the going for herd strategy, I think we'll be well above 2,000 and potentially as high as 3 or 4. I think the most effective, probably, communication strategy that has helped us tamp down the pandemic, I think, is doctors and nurses and respiratory therapists going direct to the public and explaining to them how bad things were in the hospital. We came very close to overwhelming our hospitals. Thankfully, numbers are dropping quite a bit. However, it's too early to give up now. We're not anywhere near to have it being under control right now. So the next stage is hopefully making sure that people don't create another surge with Christmas. One way to think about this is that, last week we talked about the new CDC quarantine recommendations, but you also could adapt these for your own family gathering safety. And this is what we did in our family. We have a small social bubble of four of us who are going to get together, three in our household plus my father-in-law. We have no exposures that we're aware of, but we decided to act as if we had been exposed and use this 7-day plus a 5-day negative test as an added layer of safety. And so we all did get our test done at Test Nebraska, and thankfully they're all negative and we got our results within 12 hours. We also done some track back to see if there's any other family members too, and then just hopefully give us enough safety in our family that nobody gets exposed. And so hopefully you'll take the same care with your families that we have as ours, and not do what a lot of people did with Thanksgiving, where basically people treated their test as if it were like a get out of jail free card, and that anything they did didn't matter as long as they had their negative test, which is not appropriate. Hopefully we'll also adopt a more nuanced strategy. I think part of our problem is it's been sort of an all or nothing plan. I like this New York Times article where they talk about actually striking a nice balance between restaurant capacity so they can still stay open and keep their business scope going, but also limiting the number of infections. And so this is another way of kind of looking at things, that we do not have to close everything down. We just have to do it the right way. The other problems, though, I keep seeing is there's still more conspiracy theories. So in this one, someone forwarded me a Facebook post about a pharmacist claiming that actually a lot of these cases aren't really coronavirus, they're just influenza and they're being misdiagnosed. And the reason he says this is because he hasn't filled any prescriptions for Tamiflu yet this year. Well, this is not a surprising thing that he hasn't filled any Tamiflu prescription for influenza, because everything we've been doing for masks and distancing for coronavirus also happened to stop flu. Plus, in addition to that, we've had a vaccine for influenza that we've been giving to everybody for the last few months, and our vaccination rate is higher. So you'd expect that we wouldn't have many flu cases, and this worked in the southern hemisphere already, and so this is not a surprise. And also, I guess I'd point out, he's probably never not prescribed any prescriptions to help with the symptoms of measles, polio, rubella, tetanus, typhoid, or chickenpox yet as well, because we've done public health responses with vaccinations that have actually tamped these pandemics down. So I like this visual to put out by another health department, basically looking at what we did without vaccines versus with vaccines, and how much we've limited morbidity and mortality by having good vaccination plans. If you know any older families, that members over 60, you'll notice they'll have that smallpox card. Anybody younger doesn't have that. Why? Because vaccinations work. So we're seeing a lot more vaccine misinformation, which is frustrating to me. Well, first of all, quit forwarding this stuff, and before you look at it, make sure who's writing it, what are their credentials, and Google the person who's writing it to see if they actually do have the credentials, public health background or infectious disease background or epidemiology, to know what they're actually talking about. There has been some concern, apparently, that some of the research basis and cell lines did involve potentially an aborted fetus back in the 60s. So some have said, is this an ethical concern? Well, the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops did come out and say no, that this is actually, they still recommend that you get the vaccine. Quoting that getting vaccinated safely against COVID-19 should be considered an act of love of our neighbor and part of our moral responsibility for the common good. So the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops came out in favor of all Catholics getting vaccinated here this past week. And then I think the most important thing that's, again, helping is the doctors and nurses and respiratory therapists being part of the communication strategy. I like all the vaccine selfies that I've been seeing. Some other physician colleagues I know, BJ, a neonatologist at St. Elizabeth's, showing himself getting vaccinated. Libby, who's a colleague of mine, she's an OBGYN in Grand Island, also happens to be a master's of public health and does a lot of work around breastfeeding. And so if anybody knows about the safety of breastfeeding in the vaccine, it's Libby, because she herself had a baby during the pandemic and is donating her breast milk for a study just to make sure that it's safe. So she is very much convinced that it is safe, and as if you know much about breastfeeding, one of the advantages of breastfeeding is that a mom will make antibodies to any infections in her environment that are potentially transmitted in the breast milk to the baby. So there's a good chance this is actually protective of the baby to get yourself vaccinated while you're pregnant. So vaccine questions, first they're going to start with frontline healthcare workers and nursing home folks. The breastfeeding, all experts now say it's safe. The answer for pregnancy in children is that this honestly just hasn't been studied enough yet. So if you're pregnant and want to know more about the vaccine, I don't think this is the site you should be going to, not me. You should be talking to your OBGYN about this, because this is a complicated decision. Can a vaccine be acquired? Yes, it can, but I don't think it will. And then think about side effects versus safety. What I often use is, well, if me as a 51-year-old male, what's my chance of dying of coronavirus? It's about 1 in 500. One of the chances of dying from the vaccine, well, so far, none. But let's say, just for sake of argument, the first 100,000 they got lucky and maybe there would have been one death. What does 1 in 100,000 look like compared to 1 in 500? Well, here's the difference in risk. And this is, like I say, it's actually 0, not 1. But if it were 1, this would be the comparison. So anything with a vaccine is far less risk than not having a vaccine. So definitely get a vaccine, and I'll get one as soon as it's available to me. Lastly, I do think there's a light at the end of the tunnel. Let's say herd immunity is in the 60 to 80% range. If the vaccine plus infected gets to that range, well, we could actually literally stop this virus potentially by the summer. So I do think there's some hope there. We don't know for sure that the vaccination will stop asymptomatic infections, but we're pretty sure that it would. And so let's say, for example, 25 to 35% of Nebraskans went for herd and are being infected. That means we have to get another 35 to 50% vaccinated by this summer. So far, public opinion polling says up to 70% of people would get the vaccine. So I think if it's available, I think we could easily get all these people vaccinated such that we could hit a herd immunity threshold this summer and start returning to normal and keep our vaccine deaths or our coronavirus deaths below 2,000. So my hope for the end of the year, I'll leave you with this quote from Henry Ford. Coming together is a beginning, keeping together is progress, and working together is success. And so my big hope is that we'll get away from our partisanship, start being accountable on a governmental and a personal level for the virus, and enter 2021 a much better year. So hopefully this is helpful to you. Usual disclaimer that these are my opinions, not necessarily these organizations I work with and for, but hopefully this is helpful to you, and I wish you a happy holidays.